When I first started learning about trafficking, it was such like a moment of I know that I need to do something about this, but at the same time, I don't want to look. Like, I don't want to keep digging because I don't want, like, I know what I'll find. I won't be the same. I'm not going to be the same.
There are around 28 million human trafficking victims worldwide, in every country, in every city. But many people aren't talking about it. Who will speak up to set these captives free? Join us on the Freedom Project, where we talk about ways to fight back against trafficking in our local communities. We are the next generation. We are the change.
Good morning and welcome back to the Freedom Project podcast. I'm your host, Kylie Glendenning, and today I get a special guest star, Jeff Muai. Guys, this week we get to talk about law enforcement. I know that you served on ICAC, which if you guys are not aware, this is Internet Crimes Against Children Taskforce to catch online predators and prevent child sexual exploitation. So guys, today we're going to be learning about how law enforcement plays a role in preventing and prosecuting trafficking and how you can get involved to help stop sex trafficking in your local community. So, Jeff, I wanted to ask you today, can you tell me a little bit about your story and how did you end up in law enforcement and what even made you decide to join the ICAC task force?
Okay, well, my road to law enforcement was kind of unconventional. I didn't grow up wanting to be in law enforcement or really knowing too much about it. So when I got to college and started to study at Washington State University, criminal justice was recommended as a degree to pursue, and as I went to law enforcement classes, it became an interest, and I thought maybe that might be a good career to pursue. So when I moved here to Tri-Cities, I immediately began applying for police jobs and jobs in law enforcement, and was lucky to get hired at Richland. So since being at Richland, I've been there almost 17 years, and I've worked patrol. I've been a school resource officer. I've been a street crimes detective, and right after I was on street crimes, I went to the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. And currently I'm here at the Academy, and I am an instructor and TAC officer here for new recruits.
Awesome. Wow. You've really covered a lot of the different branches within law enforcement, just a lot of different avenues. And that's awesome because then you're able to just use those resources to help educate others as well. And so guys, for those who have never heard of it, what exactly is ICAC? And what does a section of law enforcement do? We know that you went there right after you said like on street crimes.
Street crimes, yeah, so street crimes was a great job. It was very fun. You did narcotics, proactive work with human trafficking, stolen property, pretty much any crimes that were trending, we would go and attack that issue. There was some undercover work that was done as well, and it was just a really fun job. But when there became a position open on the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, I felt like my skills in social media, my skills online would play a beneficial role over there. So Internet Crimes Against Children, typically when you look nationwide, it is attached to some type of federal branch of law enforcement. So here in the Tri-Cities, we partner with Homeland Security Investigations, and we take detectives from Richland, Kennewick, and Benton County, as well as some special agents from HSI, and we combine resources together and attack specific issues of child exploitation. So we have lots of good detectives, we have lots of federal resources, lots of federal monies that we can use to specifically combat child exploitation.
Yeah, awesome. And I remember there was I want to say he worked in ICAC as well. He came and he visited our youth group, our high school youth group, and he said, isn't there only 2 ICAC resources like in Washington State? Is that true?
Right now there are 3. So we have Seattle ICAC, which is the kind of the home base for here in Washington. A lot of resources, a lot of federal funding goes through Seattle ICAC and gets funneled to the Southeast Regional Task Force, which is here in Tri-Cities. And then Vancouver has a full-time ICAC task force as well. So there's a total of 3. There's 3 full-time, so that's all we do. And then we have part-time, what we call TFOs, task force officers, or part-time partners around the state where maybe they will send a detective from their department to go get further training, and then they will do those cases as they come up in their region. But for the most part, they rely on the task forces to go and help and be responsible for investigating those cases.
Okay, awesome. So that's news to me, because from the last time I heard, I had only heard that there were 2 in Washington state. So it's good to hear that they have another one. I wanted to ask you, kind of shifting gears a little bit, what is the most common challenges that you face while investigating sex trafficking cases?
Well, I think the most common one is just manpower. Like, if you look at just a normal department, and we can kind of draw a line where it comes to human trafficking and child exploitation. When it comes to human trafficking, we're involving adults and children. When we talk about ICAC Task Force, we are specifically there for children. And we don't investigate cases involving adults. So a lot of local departments, they have some limited resources when it comes to human trafficking. We have a lot of partnerships within the community, like Mirror Ministries, SARC is there for us, and that we can use, resources that we can use to, in case we come into contact with some of those cases. But for the most part, it's manpower. And when we talk about some of the cases we worked in ICAC, there is 3 investigators and a sergeant, and then 2 special agents that are there and they're kind of responsible for other duties within Homeland Security investigations as well. So really you have 3 people for the entire region investigating these cases. So they tend to get piled up. We have to prioritize things, and when they send us 300 tips that we got to follow up on, it's a lot of work. So I would say that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that that's hard, especially like being an officer trying to, reach out and help these children when there's so many. And I think we see that a lot in social work with just an overload of cases and not enough manpower. I wanted to kind of ask you, can you describe the process of building trust with victims to help them come forward? Maybe this is within children, especially how does that play out when you're talking to children, if they're even allowed to testify in a trial?
Yeah, so children, I feel like it's easier to build trust with children than adults. Children typically, by the time we get involved in it, things have already been discovered, and we already know a lot that is going on. And children, for the most part, they want to be honest. They want to, they want help, and sometimes it's helping them recognize that something is that they're being victimized. And a lot of times with adults, they know the difference. They sometimes want help, and sometimes they don't want help, and they are more likely to shut down or just admit, it's, I'm being trafficked and I don't mind. The money's good, or, the resources that they're getting is, they're willing to live with that at the time. With children, it's their parents. Their parents are involved often, and it's trying to work through their parents and work with different advocacy groups to get help to the child. And a lot of times the children are willing to do anything at that point. So definitely a lot easier for children.
Yeah, absolutely. Something interesting, actually, from our last special guest, we had Jenna Nunez, the volunteer coordinator from Mirror Ministries, and she was talking about what they see commonly is that like 90% in the Tri-Cities of our demographic is familial trafficking, which I was not aware of. And I thought we'd see a lot more gang trafficking or like, kind of Romeo finesse, pimping, but actually it's familial, which is very crazy and sad. Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, especially because you have an interesting perspective because you work in law enforcement, but what are some misconceptions people have about sex trafficking that you'd like to clarify?
I think a lot of it is that it's voluntarily, like, for women, for example, that they're voluntarily doing that. And a lot of times that's not the case. They're either being coerced to do it, or they are being, threatened to do it, or something will happen. And a lot of times it will be in a way that they almost feel like obligated to do that type of work because of their circumstances. And there are times where it is, they're online and they are putting themselves out there willingly, and the money's good and things like that, but for the majority of the time it seems like they do not have a choice, or it's a tough cycle to get out of.
Yeah, I just finished coming from the 2024 Violence Prevention Summit. I had it down in Oregon. And one of the things that it was actually Rebecca Bender. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she's like a trafficking advocate. She's trained FBI, law enforcement, and she was in trafficking for 6 years. But she's saying that the difference is if you have a sick day and you're not able to stay home, like you're thrown out of the house, like you need to go make your quota, or if you are are about to give birth, or you're sick, you're ill, like whatever it is, and you're not able to, then it's like there's trafficking, there's force and coercion there, and it's not a job, like you're being forced to do it. And if you're not able to like have the money, if you have to give it to somebody else, it's just all things that really we don't ever think about, when we can have this idea and mentality of like, well, they choose to be there. Like, do they? If you can't leave, then it's not a choice. Another question I wanted to ask you is, how has the approach to tackling sex trafficking evolved in recent years within the police force? Like, has it changed at all? Have you seen differences?
Yeah, I mean, since I started my career 16 years ago, it's definitely changed. It is way more of a victim's approach today. Back then, I mean, we would do stings, prostitution stings, and arrest the prostitutes who are prostituting. Nowadays, if there were to be a sting, we would make sure that we have an advocate there for them, even if they are promoting themselves. A lot of times it's not the criminal route that we're going to take. It's to give them resources, to maybe get them attached to an advocacy group that can take them under their wing, teach them skills to get them out rather than to do the criminal route. So that's the biggest change I've seen. It's a more victims approach these days, and we have to get them the help that they need to get out of the cycle of just being sexually abused and exploited.
Yeah, and I think part of that is tackling the barriers to reentry, and the social stigma of like trying to come back, so they're not, going back into re-exploitation. Another question that I wanted to ask you, kind of along the same lines, is what kind of training do officers receive to effectively handle sex trafficking situations?
So it really depends on what unit you're in, or if you're going to specialize in that. The typical patrol officer will get minimal training on recognizing those, the signs, and really having to deal with the follow-up. So a lot of times your normal patrol officer who's responding to calls, they will be able to recognize it, but unless they go out of their way to seek these different advocacy groups and resources and become familiar with them, oftentimes they won't exactly know where to direct them. Mm-hmm. So usually the patrol officer will let a detective know who's either, a criminal investigation division or a more proactive unit, a plainclothes unit, or a specialized unit like ICAG, or someone who works sex crimes, and really introduce them and see if resources can be funneled to them through that group. But unless you're on these other units, so for example, street crimes, like we went to training involving human trafficking specifically, massage parlors, specifically towards massage parlors, prostitution, online exploitation, where people are exploiting themselves online, internet crimes against children. These trainings are specifically for that specific thing, and unless you're really on that unit, certain departments won't spend the money if you're just interested in it and you're not really investigating it. I'm just, on patrol, but I'm interested. Usually we won't waste the money to send a normal patrol officer there, just because we have a budget and we have to prioritize those who are actually going to investigate it to get them trained up the most.
Yeah, and I think that would have to be kind of a hard deal, like a rock and a hard place, because, you do have to be financially responsible for your program, and like whatever crimes you're seeing the most of, like those are probably, like whether it's like narcotics, like if that's the main thing, like you're going to be spending most of your money to, train them because that's what you see the most. So I can understand how that's kind of a rock and a hard place there. Another question that I wanted to ask you is, could you possibly, if you have one, could you share a success story where law enforcement was able to rescue victims and prosecute traffickers?
Yeah, so specifically, I remember when I went on to street crimes, and it was a proactive unit, a plainclothes unit. I was just coming out of the school from being a school resource officer, and I want to say it was my first week there. The captain came down and told me to follow up on kind of like a bullying case at one of the high schools. And he gave it to me just because I was coming out of the school and he knew I had some resources there. So I went and met with a 14-year-old kid and his parents about, a 30-year-old bullying him about some marijuana. And it turns out it was much more than that. And he had met this person on a website. There was some sexual things involved there as far as chats and things that were online that were exchanged. And so I began to investigate that route. I went and arrested the guy. He had a warrant anyway. So I went and arrested him and pulled him in and talked with him. And I had a 6-hour interview with the guy. And he began to tell me about a lot of the exploitation that was happening here in town that he knew about, specifically one young 14-year-old boy who was being trafficked, who was being locked up, who was being physically and sexually abused, who was being given drugs to keep him doped up so other people can come and abuse him. And when he told me the kid's first name, I immediately recognized the kid's name from being a school resource officer. He had been missing for a couple of months. And I did further follow-up with my group, and we ended up tracking him down to a house in Tri-Cities. And when we executed the search warrant, he was being abused as we were coming through the door. And as we continued on with the investigation further after we made some arrests, it turned out there were 7 or 8 people who were going to be charged with crimes associated to abusing this kid. He was being videotaped. It was being shared. He was being given drugs. He was getting physically beaten and sexually assaulted in a home here. And it was extremely sad to see. And it was hard to see. It was hard to investigate that case, knowing that adults in our community would do that to a child. And but they were charged federally. They're in prison right now, federal prison. And I've seen the young. He's not young anymore. He's an adult, but I see him around at times, and it's hard to see. It hurts my heart that he had to go through that.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that we have, officers in our, local community that are willing to, because when I first started learning about trafficking, it was such like a moment of I know that I need to do something about this, but at the same time, I don't want to look. Like, I don't want to keep digging because I don't want, I know what I'll find. I won't be the same. I'm not going to be the same. But I think that there's so much there's such an importance there, because sometimes so many people in our community, it is too hard to look, so they look away. But there's still so many children, there's so many young women, young men that are still trapped in that system that they want to be found. And I think it's really amazing that we do have people, even though it's to sometimes a detriment, of ourselves, that we're willing to push past and be like, no, we're going to find you. Like, we're going to help you. And I think that's amazing. It takes a big heart. And I wanted to ask you, this kind of leads into our next question. This is heavy. Like, this is a heavy topic. This is a heavy, heavy illicit trafficking, organization. How do you personally deal with just the emotional and psychological toll that, that comes from this line of work, having to deal with these cases and see these kiddos? Like, how do you deal with that?
I think when I initially started doing it, I was more focused on obviously the children, helping the children, and sometimes, and this is in law enforcement worldwide, just pushing things down and trying to hide them and put them away, tuck them away, because you gotta wake up tomorrow and do it again, And fortunately for our ICAC units, we do have a therapist that's attached to the unit that's available 24/7. And she's been a huge help. I have my own therapist that I see outside of that. And I have a good support system that I can rely on. And even though I have those things, it's still tough. It's still hard to deal with at times, and it's just a never-ending process of trying to cope with the things that you've seen and move forward in a positive way that is not going to affect your everyday decisions and work going forward. So I know here in Washington, we all have the same, the 3 ICAC units, we have the same therapist. She works with Idaho. She works with a ton of other police departments here in the state. So she knows exactly what we do. She goes to training with us. She knows what we investigate. And she's a huge help for us to have somebody to reach out to that understands and that can help and give us professional help.
Yeah, absolutely. I know talking with Jana on our previous episode, she talked about like prayer was just like such a big and vital part of her life and just like decompartmentalizing and also with therapy and things like that. And I think it's a really big responsibility and also just a priority that we gotta be lifting you guys up in prayer. Just praying and covering you guys, man, because this is tough work, like I want to go into mental health counseling specifically to work with sex trafficked youth, but you're seeing the worst. You're seeing like the depravity of man, and you're seeing like just the worst of what people can do, and I can't imagine like how hard that is, But I know that there is hope, especially in some of these cases. You're like, what now? I mean, they're in jail, but like, what now? How do you pick up the pieces? But we know that there is hope there to be found. And I wanted to ask you kind of at least to another question. In what ways can the public assist law enforcement in preventing and reporting sex trafficking? I know that, vigilante like that is that's not helpful. It usually wrecks cases. But what can we do to help stop and combat trafficking in aiding law enforcement?
Okay. I think one of the biggest things the community can do to help us is to give back to these advocacy groups here in town. Us in law enforcement, there's only so much we can take on. Because of red tape and things for us to accept monies and things like that. It's not really going to happen that way. And we have a set budget. We get our monies from certain places, but what really helps is the advocacy groups, in that we can, when we come into contact and we run these cases, that we can rely on people in our community to really help us. And so I would donate to those groups, Mayor Ministries, SARC, anyone else that they can research online and see. There's national groups like Operation Underground Railroad.
That's free.
Yeah, there's a lot of groups like that really support law enforcement, because they can get the money and then we just get a hold of them and we're like, hey, we need new computers to do this, or we need a space to do that. We're running this operation, we need an Airbnb so that we can do this. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones that are going to donate to that. Mm-hmm. So for the most part, I would say that is the biggest way they can help. Other ways are reporting it. Even if it's anonymous, I know it's hard, especially if it's family members, things like that, is reporting those things. And it could be anonymous. It could be through online reporting services like National Missing and Exploited Children, NECMEC, and reporting things online to them where you can just type it out. You can be anonymous, but we will follow up on it if it comes to our region. So those are some key ways I think would be beneficial for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big part of it is also recognizing, like, having that education just for the public. Because I think so many times before I learned anything about trafficking, I just, the movie Taken, like, it doesn't happen here. That's like children in Cambodia. That's, that's third world country kind of problems. Or it was, people just knocking on car windows at night, like wearing high heels. And I think, unfortunately, what Hollywood has portrayed trafficking as has really kind of desensitized us to what it actually looks like. So then we're not even reporting the right things. Like, we're not even looking for the right things. We're like, oh my goodness, this is happening over here. But this kid in your school has like 2 cell phones, and they are dressing like total shift in personality, and they have an older boyfriend, and their grades have dropped, and we're not asking why, and so we really have to know, what are we looking for? And some of the next question I wanted to ask you is, what legal policies would you like to see implemented, and how would that affect the work that you do?
I think one of the big ones is like mandatory sentences for people who are willing to exploit children like that. Oftentimes, I know with the court system, it just gets, we're talking about plea deals and this and that. And I think those who are willing to exploit children need to be held accountable, and there needs to be some mandatory things for them. Mm-hmm. Treatment, mandatory sentences, and especially when we're talking about adults in trafficking. I feel like the perpetrators who are actually running women or running sites or coercing them to do it, that they need a stiffer penalty. Oftentimes there's jail time or maybe no jail time. Okay, maybe the person, the victim, is not willing to testify, so it just kind of goes away. And those are always hard cases to see when nothing does happen and something happened. You can prove something happened, but in the court's eyes, there's just not enough. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure what specific ones, what could happen, but those are my main thoughts as far as what could happen and what I would like to see. But I know it's hard. It's tough.
Death penalty. Okay, and the next question is, what piece of information would you most want others to know about your organization, whether that it was working with ICAC or what you do now, or just law enforcement in general and how that coincides with trafficking?
I think what I'd want most people to know, it is being addressed. We're doing our best to address that and work towards saving as many victims as we can, getting them out of that situation. Oftentimes it's hard to coerce adults out of that situation, and but there's a lot of people who are willing to go there and to investigate these cases. When it comes to children, we'll always do our best to rescue children, save children from being exploited online or sexually abused. So, just know I hope people have the comfort that it is being addressed, that we're doing our best. Yeah, we would like to have 15 people on our unit, on the ICAC unit, but that's something people can partake in. As far as giving, voting for more proactive law enforcement services, having more people on the departments in their cities, if they have a chance to vote for an initiative or criminal justice sales tax, something like that, that would be beneficial to have more officers, and potentially more in these units that will investigate it.
Yeah. Absolutely. You guys hear that? You guys need to donate. Law enforcement. We got to support our law enforcement, right? Our last question that we have for you today, Jeff, is if you could give one piece of advice to an individual who wants to get involved in anti-trafficking efforts or involved in law enforcement but doesn't know where to get started, what would you point them towards?
Well, if they want to get involved in law enforcement, an easy way to do that is to go to publicsafetytesting.com, and that's typically in Washington where you're going to apply to become a police officer. So once you go there, you can fill out some paperwork. You can choose what departments you want your test scores to go to, and then you will do a written and a physical test. And your scores will get sent to those departments to get involved if you want to be a law enforcement officer. If you're just looking to get involved, the ICAC unit is always going to elementary schools, community events, and doing safety tips for online for parents, for school employees, and things like that. So if you come into contact with somebody from the task force there and ask them what they need, what they can do to help, oftentimes it's just educating others. Sometimes it's donating to local groups, and sometimes it's donating to these nationwide groups that specifically we know we can go to them and get help. Specifically one that we've used before, Operation Underground Railroad, they have donated to us, and they're always open to donating computers, or I know others on our group have gone overseas to Thailand or Cambodia and helped their police departments set up forensic labs, computers, and things, and that was all, the majority was donated by them. So donating to those national groups that support law enforcement and that donate to them and give them opportunities to train, give them opportunities to receive resources to address those certain crimes.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us on the Freedom Project podcast. It was really awesome. I was so excited because I really wanted to hit that trifecta. I wanted to talk to sex trafficking advocates who work in the social service kind of industry, those in law enforcement, and then those in governmental political realms. So it was super awesome to have you here, especially because you worked on ICAC and have that experience from that. And you guys, thank you for tuning into this episode. If you would like to learn more about trafficking and how you can get involved to help stop sexual exploitation, feel free to check out our other episodes, and make sure to follow me on the Freedom Project TC for Tri-Cities. That is the Freedom Project on Instagram. And go ahead and make sure to leave us a follow so you don't miss any episodes when we update. Thank you so much and have a great day. Go forth and be the change.